Hello, and welcome to ELA Plus, your guide to English studies and the English language arts. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. In today's video lesson, we're going to read and analyze William Shakespeare's Sonnet No. 7. Now, it pains me to admit that the villain of this series, Don Patterson, is actually right about something for once. In his book, Reading Shakespeare's Sonnets, a New Commentary, he writes that Sonnet No. 7 is an unconvincing poem. I tend to agree with him on this one. It's not that necessarily Sonnet No. 7 is a bad poem. Think of it more like the weakest track on a Beatles album. It only pales in comparison to the brilliance that surrounds it. As compared to contemporaneous poems, it's probably still quite good. But again, just not as good as everything else that's found within this sonnet cycle. Let's see exactly why that is. The first thing we're going to do in this video lesson is read Sonnet No. 7. After that, I'll offer a contemporary plain English version of the poem so you at least have an understanding on a surface level of what's going on. And then we'll get right into our analysis. We'll begin the analysis by first defining what a metaphor is, as well as its component parts, and then I'll talk about Sonnet No. 7's metaphor and why, for the most part, I think it fails. After that, we'll talk about the religious language of Sonnet No. 7 and why it seems incomplete and doesn't really go anywhere. And then we'll talk about the key word. The key word is an important part of this sonnet cycle, and it's brought to our attention by the great Helen Vendler. After that, we'll talk about Sonnet No. 7's Phonaesthetics, paying particular attention to the use of meter and how meter contributes to our sonic enjoyment of poetry. And then we'll wrap everything up with some comprehension questions. Let's go. ELA Plus has a method for reading poetry. And if you're interested in learning how to do that, that is, how to read poetry intelligently, please see our video lesson, How to Read a Poem. It's linked to down in the description. The first step of our method is that you must read the poem to yourself first. So if you haven't already done that, please pause the video and do so now. For those of you who have already read the poem to yourself, great. We're ready for the next step. And that step is to read the poem aloud. And we can do that together. Lo, in the orient, when the gracious light lifts up his burning head, each under eye doth homage to his new appearing sight, serving with looks his sacred majesty. And having climbed the steep up heavenly hill, resembling strong youth in his middle age, yet mortal looks adore his beauty still, attending on his golden pilgrimage. But when from highmost pitch, with weary car, like feeble age he reeleth from the day, the eyes, for duteous, now converted are from his low tract, and look another way. So thou, thyself outgoing in thy noon, unlooked on diest, unless thou get a son. Okay, that's William Shakespeare's Sonnet No. 7. Now, in my opinion, Sonnet No. 7 is a little bit more difficult for modern readers to follow. So developing a contemporary plain English version is of particular importance. And that's what I'll do for you right now. When the sun rises in the east, all the people pay homage to it by gazing upon it adoringly in all of its sacred majesty. And even after climbing to its zenith at noon, the sun retains all of its attractiveness, like a young man in his prime. In fact, the people continue to adore its golden pilgrimage. But when the sun falls from its zenith, it reels about like an old man and becomes ugly. The people no longer want to look at it, and they turn their gaze in other directions. This is exactly what's going to happen to you if you continue to waste your sexual energy during your prime. You'll die alone and unloved unless you father a son. Great! Now that we've read the poem and developed a plain English contemporary version, it's now time to get into our close reading analysis. We'll begin the analysis by first defining what a metaphor is, as well as its component parts, and then we'll identify what the extended metaphor is of Sonnet No. 7. After that, we'll talk a little bit about the religious language that Shakespeare uses in the poem. And then we'll get into this idea of the key word. The key word is something that's identified by Helen Vendler in her great book, The Art of Shakespeare's Sonnets. And the first key word in the entire cycle is in Sonnet No. 7. This is going to be an interesting discussion. I think you'll like it. And then we'll wrap things up with a discussion of the poem's phonaesthetics, paying particular attention to the use of meter. To begin with, I'd say that the most striking aspect of Sonnet No. 7 is that it's an exercise in the use of extended metaphor. That is to say, the speaker develops a single metaphor throughout the entirety of the poem in an effort to convince the young man that the young man needs to reproduce. Now, a metaphor, for those of you who don't recall from our video lesson for sonnet number 1, is the implicit or explicit identification of one thing for another thing. Further, there are two important component parts of a metaphor: the tenor and the vehicle. The tenor is the thing that's being described. The vehicle is the figurative language used to describe the tenor. So now let's go further into the poem and let's unpack what the metaphor is of sonnet number 7 and try to identify the tenor and the vehicle. In sonnet number 7, the speaker uses a vivid comparison between the sun's daily journey across the sky and the passage of human life. To integrate our definition of metaphor into it, we can say that in sonnet number 7, the speaker explicitly identifies one thing, the young man's beauty, with another thing, the sun. In the first quatrain, we see the sun rising in the east, radiating its brilliance. Everyone, personified by the under eye, pays homage to this glorious sight. This use of under eye for everyone, by the way, is one of the few successes of the poem, in my opinion. For me, as I've said before, novelty of expression is part of what assists a poem in achieving that emotional and intellectual impact necessary for quality poetic experience. Now, if you didn't understand what the speaker meant by under eye, that's fine. Think of it like this. We see semi-regular use of the sun as a metaphor for an eye in English Renaissance era literature and even today. For instance, we today have this cliché expression, or some variation of it, the sun looks down upon the earth. So the sun is the above eye. Humans are under the sun, so they become, in sonnet number 7, the under eyes. Quick side note, in 11 weeks we're going to return to this metaphor of the sun as heaven's eye in the famous Sonnet 18. Get ready. Now in the second quatrain, the speaker extends the metaphor as the sun ascends to midday. Here, the speaker likens the midday sun to a strong youth in his prime. The youth's beauty, just like the midday sun, in his prime, retains the admiration and the attention of the people. But the mood shifts in the third quatrain. Just as the sun weakens and descends in the late afternoon, so too will youthful beauty inevitably fade. The final line of this quatrain, like feeble age he reeleth from the day, paints a rather melancholic image of decline, wouldn't you say? By the way, if you were confused as to what Shakespeare means by wary car in this quatrain, I'm pretty sure he's alluding to Helios, the Greek god who personifies the sun. Helios drives his chariot, his car, across the sky, his radiant crown offering light to the world. Relevant to the young man sonnets, Helios is often described as a very attractive young man. The final couplet delivers the speaker's forceful message. The young man, like the setting sun, will be forgotten and ignored unless he procreates. Having children, therefore, becomes a way to defy mortality and ensure the continuation of the youth's beauty beyond his lifespan. I'd also like to point out that this concluding couplet is a fruitful sexual metaphor. Makes sense, after all. We're still in the procreation sonnets, and the couplet is the only component part of sonnet number 7 where the speaker explicitly calls for the young man to reproduce. The sexual metaphor in the couplet is the speaker's use of the word noon in line 13. As Catherine Duncan Jones points out in her Ardent Shakespeare, noon was often recognized as a metaphor for erections. Here we see 3 examples. Sonnet number 7, there on the left, Sonnet 76 from Sir Philip Sidney's great 16th century sonnet sequence, Astrophel and Stella, in the middle, and Romeo and Juliet there on the right, taken from Act 2, Scene 4 of that play. Pardon the somewhat puerile nature of this part of the lecture, but these noonish lines are just great. Look at the Sidney. Wow. He sees his love's 2 shining twins moving towards him, and as they bear their light upon him, he reports, "It groweth noon with me." It groweth noon with me. Indeed, that's Renaissance riz right there, ladies and gentlemen. Not to be outdone, Shakespeare has Mercutio deliver a bona fide all-timer when he meets the nurse character. Remember that this is the act where Romeo tells Mercutio of his newfound love for Juliet. When the nurse asks how this is going, Mercutio replies, "The body hand of the dial is now upon the prick of noon." I can't wait to discuss Mercutio with you all when we do our Romeo and Juliet course. This dude is like the ultimate literary six-man. He comes off the bench and puts up 20 points like it's nothing. He's like the Kevin McHale of supporting characters in the works of Shakespeare. I love him. Anyway, this is the extended metaphor of sonnet number 7. The speaker makes explicit the identification of the sun's daily journey with a young man's beauty. In the early stages of the day, the sun rises in refulgent splendor, attracting the looks of all the people, until of course its light goes out and the people finally turn away from it. Likewise, the young man's beauty will attract the attention of everyone during his youth, but in his middle age and then as he gets old, people are going to start looking for beauty in other places. Now, can you identify the tenor and the vehicle of this metaphor? Remember that the tenor is the thing being described by the metaphor, and the vehicle is the figurative language used to describe the tenor. Well, if you identified the tenor as the young man's beauty and the vehicle as the sun, then go ahead and pat yourself on the back. You correctly identified both the tenor and the vehicle. Now, a good practice moving forward with these sonnets, and indeed any poem that you want to read closely, would be for you to think about the poem's metaphor and also try to identify that metaphor's tenor and vehicle. So we have this extended metaphor of the sun as the young man's beauty being developed throughout the entirety of sonnet number 7. Why does it fail? Why is it that Don Patterson claims that this poem is unconvincing? Well, let's ask the villain himself. The metaphor isn't good because the ground is overextended. The metaphor, in outstaying its welcome, has begun to creak. To say that human eyes who once looked dutifully upon the young man's sun look away in the afternoon and evening of the young man's son's life is actually true only for the young man, who will in all probability lose his beauty. Like me, you will have often admired the sun at 4 o'clock, or sat blissed out and mind-blown before a gorgeous sunset. The claim that the ground of the metaphor contains the term something whose beauty fades after its halfway point simply isn't true. He's right. It doesn't work, does it? I mean, who among us doesn't admire a sunset? I'd say sunsets enjoy universal acclaim. And further, aside from the extended metaphor not working, I'd also argue that Shakespeare's use of religious language in this poem is also weak and also doesn't work. Throughout sonnet number 7, we're offered a great number of religious words or religious references. For instance, we have the words gracious, homage, sacred, heavenly, adore, pilgrimage, and converted. To what end does the speaker employ these religious terms? It's not clear to me. Perhaps it is to you, though. Let me know down in the comments. We do get this reference to a sun in the concluding couplet, and clearly the notion of a sun is related to the Trinitarian Christian Godhead. But even so, I can't quite figure out why it's necessary to include these religious undertones in the poem. They don't seem to connect to the themes or the extended metaphor that we discussed previously. I mean, maybe, if we want to go full English major on everyone, we could say that sonnet number 7 is a clandestine Trinitarian allusion in that God the Father is represented by His Sacred Majesty in line 4, while Christ the Son is represented in line 14, and then the Holy Ghost, the Son itself, which as we've established is the vehicle of the extended metaphor, but it never appears, hanging over the poem like a ghostly apparition. That is, the word Son, S-U-N, doesn't appear in the poem. I don't know. Again, what do you think? Let me know down in the comments below. Now that we've covered the metaphor and the religious undertones of sonnet number 7, it's now time to talk about this idea of the key word. The key word is an idea that's developed in the book The Art of Shakespeare Sonnets by Helen Vendler. And if you're going to purchase any book on Shakespeare sonnets other than the Stephen Booth, which we're using in these video lessons, make it Helen Vendler's book, The Art of Shakespeare Sonnets. Fantastic book. Not only does it have very insightful and compelling content, it's also a very beautiful hardback edition, which will look great on your bookshelf. So, if you've been watching these video lessons, you know that we always talk about the couplet tie. And the couplet tie is when a word appears in the body of the sonnet, that is one of the 3 quatrains, and also in its couplet. The idea of the couplet tie was also developed by Helen Vendler. And the key word is similar to this idea. What distinguishes the key word, however, from the couplet tie is this. The key word appears in all component parts of the sonnet. That is, quatrain 1, quatrain 2, quatrain 3, and the concluding couplet. The key word is going to appear at least once in all of those. In sonnet number 7, we have the first instance in the sonnet cycle of a key word. Have you identified it? Good on you if you identified the word look and its variants as the key word of sonnet number 7. As you can see here, the word looks appears in the first quatrain in line 4. The word looks also appears in line 7 of the second quatrain. And then in the third quatrain, we have the word look. And finally, in the concluding couplet, we have the word unlooked in line 14. At this point, you might be asking yourself, so what, Brian? Some poet used the same word 4 times in a 14-line poem. What's the big deal? Well, I'd argue that, as we know, Shakespeare is a poet of great genius and precision, so the use of the repetition of this word throughout the sonnet cannot be the result of just chance. There must have been a reason for it. Further, I'd argue that using a word 4 times in a 14-line poem is actually quite difficult, especially if you want to make it seem not forced. As Helen Vendler writes, it is easy for an author writing a sonnet to use a given word in the first quatrain, and still fairly easy in the second quatrain. But as the vortex of meaning and development tightens, quatrain 3 puts a greater demand on ingenuity to insert the word. In the couplet, with only 2 lines to work instead of 4, and with closure necessary, is the hardest job of all. This difficulty is made much more impressive if you consider sonnet number 7's structure, which Helen Vendler points out is actually a double narrative. I've color-coded it here for you on the side. The double narration in sonnet number 7 is this. In the first 2 lines of every quatrain, you're going to get a description of the sun's movement across the sky, followed by the second 2 lines of the quatrain being the people's response to the sun's movement. So if it's difficult for a poet to include 4 words throughout 14 lines, imagine the difficulty Shakespeare had in only limiting himself to the final 2 lines of each quatrain. Impressive. And that brings us to our analysis of the phonaesthetics of sonnet number 7. As you'll recall from our video lesson on Shakespeare's sonnet number 6, phonaesthetics is the study of the beauty or pleasantness of sound in spoken language. Now, poets have a great deal of phonaesthetic tools to draw from. In this particular video lesson, what I'd like to focus on is meter. Meter is the measured pattern of rhythmic accents in a line of verse. Now, I'm sure the first thing that you did after reading sonnet number 7 is you engaged in a little bit of scansion because you wanted to analyze its metrical patterns. After all, the best way to amplify the emotional impact of a poem is to engage in cold, scientific dissection. Now, when you did this scansion, no doubt you already knew that a sonnet is an example of accentual syllabic meter. And what this is, it's a system of meter based on both the number of syllables in a line and a pattern of stresses in each metrical unit. Specifically, a sonnet is written in iambic pentameter. For those of you who don't know what iambic pentameter is, please see our video lesson, The English Sonnet. It's linked to down in the description. In a nutshell, however, iambic pentameter is a line of poetry that is 10 syllables and consists of alternating unstressed and stressed syllables. That is what makes a sonnet an example of accentual syllabic meter. When you perform this dissection of sonnet number 7, this is what you probably found. As you can see, it does not conform to the sonnet's accentual syllabic metrical rules. Start with the syllable count. We see that 3 of the lines are nonconformist, lines 1, 11, and 14. These lines are apparently what we call hypermetrical. They feature more syllables than what we'd expect given the traditional format. These lines, as you counted, feature 11 syllables rather than the 10 we expect in the traditional format of the sonnet. Naturally, the hypermetrical nature of these 3 lines disturbs the accentual count in addition to the metrical count. A sonnet is supposed to be isometric. An isometric poem is a poem that follows a set meter. That set meter for sonnets, as we know, is iambic pentameter. These three hypermetrical lines, therefore, violate the isometric rules of the sonnet. A line of iambic pentameter has 5 feet of iambs. An iamb is a 2-syllable foot of one unstressed syllable, followed by a stressed syllable. Line 1, as you can see, has 4 iambs with an anapest thrown in there. An anapest is a 3-syllable foot with 2 unstressed syllables, followed by a stressed syllable. The anapest in line 1 is found in the 4th foot of the line. Line 11 follows the same accentual count as in line 1. Line 14 moves the anapest to the 3rd foot. Now you may be asking yourself right now why all this matters. After all, very few people who read poetry do scansion. They think very little, if any do at all, of the accentual syllabic meter of a poem. You're right, they don't. But I'd argue the importance is indeed subtle but consequential, particularly for people interested in understanding why poetry either works or doesn't work as an experiential or aesthetic emprise. As we shared with you in our video lesson, How to Read a Poem, poetry is a type of music. The accentual syllabic meter of a poem, therefore, is the poem's rhythm, its beat, its musicality. When the isometric nature of a sonnet is disturbed, like it is here, that musicality loses, I'd say, a lot of its phonaesthetic delight. So why would Shakespeare do this? Well, he's actually not violating the isometric nature of the sonnet. You need to keep in mind 2 things. 1. We're reading the Booth version of the sonnets, and Stephen Booth wants us to as closely approximate as we can the reading experience of the early modern English readers of Shakespeare's time. And 2, as we learned in the previous video lesson, early modern English differs from our contemporary English in some important ways. Here, for instance, we have a side-by-side comparison. We have the contemporary English accentual syllabic metrical breakdown on the left side of the screen, and then we have early modern English and its accentual syllabic breakdown on the right side of the screen. I've highlighted for you the differences in pronunciation of the 3 words that disturbed the accentual syllabic breakdown in contemporary English. As Booth tells us, the word orient in early modern English was not a word of 3 syllables like we have it today, but rather it was disyllabic, that is, 2 syllables. Further, in line 12, duteous likewise has 2 syllables rather than the 3 that we use today. Finally, the word diest is monosyllabic in early modern English, not disyllabic like we pronounce it today. As you can see on the right side of the screen, an early modern English reading of Sonnet No. 7 restores all the accentual syllabic metrical conventions of the sonnet. It is once again isometric. Okay, so that's our video lesson on William Shakespeare's Sonnet No. 7. In this video lesson, first we read Sonnet No. 7, and then I offered you a plain English contemporary version of the poem. Then we got right into the analysis, where we discussed first its metaphor, then we talked about its religious undertones, and then we introduced the concept of the key word. After that, we focused a little bit on the poem's phonaesthetics, particularly meter. And now, it's time for some comprehension questions. Number 1. What is your opinion of Sonnet No. 7? Do you agree or disagree that this is one of the weaker poems in the sonnet cycle so far? Number 2. What does it mean if a poem is isometric? Number 3. What is accentual syllabic meter? Number 4. What is a metaphor? And what is the extended metaphor found in Sonnet No. 7? Number 5. What is a tenor? And what is the tenor in this poem? Number 6. What is a vehicle? And what is the vehicle of this extended metaphor? Number 7. Define the term key word according to Helen Vindler. And what is the key word of Sonnet No. 7? All right, that's it. That concludes our lesson on William Shakespeare's Sonnet No. 7. I sincerely hope you enjoyed it and that you learned something from it. If you did, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. To that end, also consider sharing it with friends, fellow students, and even your English teacher. Also, feel free to ask me any questions about this video lesson if you have any. Remember that ELA Plus is your YouTube guide to English studies and the English language arts. subscribe to learn more. Until our next lesson, keep reading and take care of yourselves and others. Thank you.